Well, good morning again. We are in the middle of starting a new series looking at Jesus and his life as we head in towards Easter. What I wanted to focus on is how it seems like Jesus appealed to people, especially at the beginning, and how they would pour out to hear him. I was trying to think of a title for the series, and the title I kept coming back to was "The Most Interesting Man in the World." The problem with that title, of course, is that there was a beer company that used it first. So I need to talk about that real fast, and then we'll leave that behind us. But there was a beer company in 2006 had this idea to make a commercial about the most interesting man in the world. So they made up a fictional guy, this guy, and they said all kinds of different things. That he had wrestled alligators and arm wrestled Fidel Castro, and I wrote down some of it. That he once went to a psychic to warn her, which is that kind of stuff, right? His only regret is that he never felt regret. That was one of the things about him. But at the end of it, he would be with the beer there, and he'd say, "I don't often drink beer, but when I do, I drink this beer." What was strange to me just about how things work and how people are, and is that this led to a big increase in beer sales. I mean, people. A 10% increase over the time that they were doing it, that it just kept growing, and people were buying this particular beer because of this fictional guy who wasn't even there, that they wanted to be associated with that. It's always been curious to me how that works. The reason why companies will pay big money to have some famous athlete or some famous actress or actor or celebrity endorse their product is because people will see that. And they will say, well, then if I buy what they're selling, then I'll be more like them. And you don't think it through like that in your head. You don't process all that out. Nobody does. But that's what they're banking on you thinking subconsciously, that if you see this guy wear those shoes or this guy use that shampoo or this person eats at Burger King, then you'll want to do those things because the other person did. A few years ago, I was getting my lawnmower repaired, and when I was at the shop, there was a poster at the shop of the newest version of whatever lawnmower that was there they were selling, and there's two ladies in bikinis beside this guy as he's sitting there on his mower. And again, you would think, well, why would that, how's that? But I promise that there was some guy walked in there and thought, hey, I could mow my yard much sexier than I have, and that they bought the mower because of seeing that. That if I had a better mower, who knows where my life would go? Who knows how things would go? And of course, there's no logic to it. There's no logic to it. It's like beer commercials where everybody selling the beer is completely slim. Okay, it doesn't totally make sense, but you're not supposed to think about that, right? You're supposed to think about, okay, if I had that, then I would get this. If I was like that, then I would be like this person, and I could be interesting. Or I could be whatever else. It's strange to me how that happens. It's strange to me how that happens, that if you see that what becomes trendy or popular, there's a tipping point with that sort of thing. Like it may take a long time for something to get to a certain level of popularity, but once it crosses that tipping point, whatever that is, then it becomes easier to expand it. You even see that with churches. If a church may take forever to get to a certain number with that church, but if they can get to that number, it's easier to go from that number sometimes because people will come to the crowd. People assume, well, if there's a crowd there already, well, that must mean something. I don't know why that works. I don't know why that makes sense. It seems like we would be able to see through that all the time, but we aren't. And that's where it gets back to thinking about Jesus. Is that Jesus was building crowds early. And partly building crowds because he was doing miracles. And partly it was that. He was turning water to wine and healing people who had been sick for a long time. He was doing some amazing things. But it was mostly his teaching. But there's a point where the growth of it just it becomes its own phenomenon. And people are just pouring out to see Jesus because he's interesting. Right? Let's just see what this guy will do next. Okay, I could do a sermon series just about that, because that's interesting to me all by itself. But what I wanted to think about, though, what was curious to me, is that as people got close to Jesus, really close, a lot of people, once they got in, said, I don't want this. Which seems like kind of a weird thing to preach about. It seems like it can be counterintuitive. But it's curious to me that people think he's really interesting. They want to get close to him at a distance. But they don't want to get too close, because if they do, it's too much. He's not like a lot of other celebrities. I don't know what I think about my favorite people. I assume that if I could just meet some of these guys that I look up to. We'd be instant friends. We could just hang out and we'd just like each other. But probably that wouldn't be true. Probably when I got to know them, I'd find out some wrinkles about them that I didn't like. And there's some of that with Jesus too. But it's more than that. It's more than that. People like him when they can have him at arm's length, but they don't always like him when he gets too close. He starts making them uncomfortable. And I wanted to think about that over the next few weeks. I just wanted to think about that thing because there's a dozen stories like that in the Bible. I'm just going to pick 3 or 4 or 5 of them, but there's a bunch of stories like that. And so that's what I did this week. Just take one of the stories where that happens. It says Jesus returned to Galilee. Now, Galilee was kind of his home province, his home state, for lack of a better word. He returned to Galilee by the power of the Spirit, and news about him spread through the whole countryside. And it was he was teaching in their synagogues, and everybody praised him. So he leaves his home area, and he's gone for a few months, and then he comes back, and now it's a whole different animal. When he leaves, he's just some dude, but when he comes back, there's this whole crowd around him. And it's a mass of people, and they're wanting to hear what he has to say, and the movement of it is growing, right? The popularity of it's growing. Everybody's praising him. And so he leaves, and he's nobody, and he comes back, and he's a celebrity, and people are wanting to hear this guy and see what he has to say. He says he went to Nazareth, which was his hometown. Well, he comes right back to his hometown and where he had been brought up. And on the Sabbath day, he went to the synagogue, which was they still call synagogues. It's like the church meeting kind of what Jews do. And that was his custom, and that's what he always did. And he stood up to read, and they gave him the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, and they asked him to look at that. So normally in a synagogue service then, it would start with a reading of Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is God, the Lord is one. And everybody would say that together. And then there'd be a time of prayer, and then they would read a section out of the law, the first 5 books of the Bible. Then they would read a section out of the prophets, and then somebody would do a sermon. Well, Jesus has been gone, and his custom was to go to this every time he was around, but he's been gone, and he's come back, and when he comes back, he's got this huge crowd. He's a hero, kind of. And so they say, hey, why don't you do the preaching, Jesus? And he had never done that before, but they hand him the scroll. Hey, why don't you say something about these things? And so he does. He says, unrolling it, he found the place where it's written, the Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. And he sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, for the oppressed, set them free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And then he rolled up the scroll, and he handed it back to the attendant, and he sat down. The eyes of everyone was fastened on him, it says. And he began by saying to them, today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. So I want to think about what he's saying here first before we get too far. The last thing he says would have been a little shocking. He says that prophecy that Isaiah made, that's Isaiah 61, that prophecy that Isaiah made about a guy who will come and will heal the blind and free the prisoners and lift up the poor, he says, today that's happening. And by implication, it's me. I'm the one. He says, I'm the one you've been waiting on. Now, it's interesting to think about that, first of all, because it's such a bold, almost arrogant thing to say. You can imagine people taking it wrong. He can say it because it's true, but it would not be immediately received as true. If my first Sunday, my first Sunday here was 2008. If I had opened up on my very first sermon here and said, "I'm the one you've been waiting on," that was my first line in my sermon. I'm the one you've been waiting on. There'd be a handful of people, maybe, who would say, "Well, cool, great, finally." But most people would probably say, "Who do you think you are? I mean, who do you think you are to get up and say things like that? I mean, who do you really, right?" And that's kind of how they react too. And we'll look at that here in a second. But I want you to catch the brashness of it, the arrogance of it almost. He just tosses it out there. I'm the one you've been waiting on. Today, this is all happening. Okay, well, what's happening? What's he talking about? Well, let me back up. If you look at the very beginning here, you can read it literally, and that's not a bad way to read it. So let's look at it literally first. He says, the Spirit of the Lord is on me. God has given me personal direction to do what I do. He says he's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor, freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, set the oppressed free. You could take all that literal, and if you did, then the sense is Jesus says, I came here to make it better for people who are knocked down. For people who life has knocked down, I've come here to make it better. I've come to lift the poor and the medically handicapped and the ones who are losing in life. I've come to make their life better. And so because he said that, most churches try to lift up people who are knocked down. That's what churches do. We get calls during the week sometimes from people who do not go here. And they'll ask if we can help them with something. Can you help? We can't pay our electric. We can't pay our gas, or we can't pay for this thing or that thing. We don't have enough clothes. We don't have enough food. Can you help us? And there are other Christian ministries in town that we refer them to sometimes. If it's food, hey, Life Food Pantry will help you. We sponsor them, and they will help you. And if that person were to go to Life Food Pantry, they'd walk in and say, hey, are you guys Christians? They'd say, yeah. And if the person who came in said, well, I'm not a Christian, and I don't intend to be a Christian. Can I get some food? They would say, yeah. Because part of what Jesus came is to help us help people up. And you can read it literal. The reason we make beds for kids who don't have beds is because you can read this literal. That Jesus came to lift people up. That's part of why he came. That's part of the agenda. That's part of why he came, to meet the people. The thing that Gabe's talking about. Why should we care about elderly people in Mexico? Well, because Jesus does. If he does, then we do. Gabe mentioned a deal in first service that he didn't say it second, but he said a lot of times in Mexico, because the social safety net is not nearly as expansive as it is here. Families will find they can't take care of their older grandparent, so they'll take them in the street in a wheelchair and just leave them there with their birth certificate until the police find them. And then they end up in this home. Why should we care? It's awful. Why should we care? Because Jesus cares. Because Jesus cares. We're going to ask you to give your hard-earned money to that thing. Why? Because Jesus cares. So that's one thing. But that's not the only way to read this, and it's not the way that I want you to read it. I want you to see something else here. Because Jesus, part of why he came was to set us free from sin, right? He died on the cross to pay for our sin. And you can read this that he's talking about that too. Spirit of the Lord's on me. Same thing. God's got me on his hand. He's taken me someplace. But I'm to proclaim good news to the poor. And sin, for whatever else it does, it impoverishes people. It makes you needy. Sin makes you needy. The person who drinks too much, when they first started, they were concerned about the flavors and the brands, and all that meant something to them, and now they're buying wine out of a box, and it doesn't mean that much to them at all. They just want to get it as quickly as they can, right? They need it now. They didn't need it before, they need it now. Sin makes you needy. It makes you poor. And part of why Jesus came was to proclaim good news to the poor, to proclaim freedom for the prisoners. Sin enslaves you. You just can't break away from it. You want to, but you can't. You say, I'm never going to get into this argument again. I'm never going to do this stupid thing again. Maybe you've even prayed that. God, if you'll forgive me for this, I'll never do it again. I don't ever want to feel this low again. And then you do it again because sin ensnares. Sin blinds you. Jesus came to give you sight, and sin blinds you. I know I use this illustration a lot, but it's just because it's such an effective description. When I'm on the road, sin blinds me. If somebody passes me, they're a jerk. If I pass them, it's because I'm in a hurry, right? I don't give them the same benefit of the doubt that I give myself. I've always got a reason for what I do. If I'm close to the person in front of me, it's because they're not driving fast enough. If somebody's close to me, it's because they're obnoxious, and I don't see it. And by the way, if you point it out to me while I'm driving, it'll make me mad. I don't want to hear that because I don't see it when I'm doing it. I see it. I can see it now. I see it now standing in front of you, but I don't see it then. And I'm like that with 1,000 things. Have you ever gotten into an argument and in the middle of the argument, the other person's talking, and you have this thought in your head, how did I get here? I'm not even mad about this. What left turn did I take to get into this hole? And you don't even know what you did. I mean, you're blind to it. You don't see it. And sin does that. And sin oppresses. And so he says, I'm here to declare the year of the Lord's favor. And he's referring to something in the Old Testament called Jubilee. And on Jubilee, which is once every 50 years, all the debts are forgiven. There's no more mortgages. There's no more credit card debt. There's no more bills for anything. It's all forgiven. All the slaves are set free. All the grudges are let go. It was supposed to be something they did pretty regularly, just to keep the accounts cleared. There's not much record they did it very often, because it's hard to do. But Jesus says, I come to do it. Today's that day. I'm proclaiming today, he says, to be the day when everything turns around. He says, I'm the one you've been waiting on. This moment is the moment you've been waiting on. Well, the people, they all spoke well of him, and they're amazed at his gracious words. But it says, but isn't this Joseph's son? We know this guy. He grew up here. They said, how's he going to change anything? You know, and people will say that about anybody who gets kind of fired up about God. I mean, we know you. You've lived here your whole life. We know what you're like. And so Jesus is kind of ticked off about it. And he says, surely you'll quote this proverb to me, physician, heal yourself. In other words, if you're such a good doctor, why aren't you doing good? You know, why aren't you richer? Why aren't you better looking? Why aren't you? Or he says, or you'll tell me, do here the miracles you did in these other places, like in Capernaum. He says, I tell you, there's no prophet accepted in their hometown. Now that's an interesting thing. You want to think about that too, right? You want to dig around in that for a second. We honor heroes. If somebody in the hometown goes on and does some great thing, we will honor that hero. Mitchell, Gus Grissom's been gone for 60 years, 70 years, right? And they still advertise, don't they, that this is his hometown. They're still proud of him. You can go to the museum or see where he was born. I mean, you can still go to those things. If you there's a statue for Damon over there in Heltonville. I mean, if you're a hero, if you do something great, we remember the heroes, right? We get excited about heroes. So Jesus is not saying that, because that's not true. Heroes are always accepted, but prophets are not always accepted. So what's the difference between a prophet and a hero? Well, a prophet's telling you that things have to change. Things have to change. The way we've been doing things isn't working, and things have to change. There's this weight that hangs over everything. We all feel it. This life should be easier than it is. Why is it this hard to manage relationships? Why can two people genuinely like each other but have such a hard time holding a marriage together? Why is that hard? Why do people backstab one another? Why do people cheat on one another? Why do people lie to one another? I mean, this should be easier than it is, right? And so Jesus comes into that situation and he says, I'm the one you're waiting on. And not everybody's wanting to jump in line behind Jesus, because no prophet's accepted in his hometown. And then Jesus really goes off on them. And you might not know all these Old Testament stories, so I'll try to do them real fast. But he says, I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time when the sky was shut for 3.5 years and there was a severe famine in the land. But Elijah was not sent to any of those widows, but to this widow up the coast in Sidon. Okay, so if you don't remember that story, there's a famine, 3 years. Elijah was the great prophet of the day, but when it comes time to actually help some lady feed her family, he does a miracle for this foreigner. And the implication that Jesus is making is there was nobody in Israel that he could go to. Nobody would follow him. Nobody would listen to him, so he goes where he will be listened to. And then so there was another guy, Elisha. And I know Elisha and Elijah sound the same, but they're two prophets right back to back there. And Elisha said, lots of guys had leprosy when Elisha was here, and yet not one of them was healed. Only Naaman, who was a Syrian. Again, the same implication. Nobody would listen to Elijah. Nobody would listen to Elisha. So they went to where somebody would listen to them. And by further implication, Jesus is saying, listen, I'm telling you this, but if you don't want it, fine. Somebody will, and I'll go tell them. And it's that thing that ticks them all off. When the people heard that, it says they were furious when they heard him. Jesus was real interesting at a distance. Everybody praised him. Everybody was amazed. But then when you start hearing what he really thinks, I mean, it ticked them off. And it says they got up and they drove him to the edge of town. Out there on the hill, there's a cliff, and they're going to toss him off the cliff. But he says he walks right through them. They were asking for a miracle. Do what you did in Capernaum, but But here's the miracle. They can't touch him. I don't know. It's an interesting. Some of the miracles in the Bible aren't really spelled out exactly how this worked. This reads like he didn't escape. Like one day they're getting ready to throw out the cliff. Where'd Jesus go? It's not like that. It's just he just says, no, we're not going to do this, and he walks through the crowd. No, I don't think this is going to happen. And either because they're intimidated by him or scared of him, or because it's a miracle, they don't do anything, and he just leaves. Okay, I want to think about all that. And that's what we're going to close our sermon with, and just thinking about all that and what all that means, because I really do think that Jesus came to set us free and to open our eyes, to give us hope. I think Jesus really did come so that people, even today, that scripture can be fulfilled. I really believe that. I think the same message that was true then is true now, and a lot of people are skeptical about it. Either because they're scared that people are going to talk about them behind their back if they get real serious about this thing, or just because they're not sure it'll work. But I think it will, and I think it's always been true, and I think it's still true. We live in an amazing time. I'm 55. People who are younger than me, if you're much younger than me, you may not appreciate exactly how amazing a time it is, but we're just in a really prosperous time. I remember going to school in jeans that had patches on them, and other guys did that too. And nobody does that today unless they're pants they bought with patches on them, right? I mean, nobody has to do that anymore. I mean, the biggest, poorest family in town doesn't have to do that anymore. We're just in a different world. I remember when I was a kid, one of my friends had a phone in his room, and how amazing that was. He had a phone in his room, and nobody I knew had a phone in their room. What an amazing thing that was. And not one of you guys would blink at a 12-year-old with a smartphone. Not one of you would. It's not every 12-year-old has one, but enough of them do that you just don't think anything about it. It is not at all unusual to go to a restaurant and see a 6-year-old on an iPad doing something while they're waiting for their food. We're in such a rich time. I mean, just crazy how much money is floating around just in my lifetime compared to what life was like when I was a kid. It's just hard to calculate how much easier it is financially than it was then, how much easier it is technologically than it was then. Science, how much smarter we are about everything today than we were then. A friend of mine had to go in for surgery a couple of months ago for a gallbladder surgery. They were in and out in one day. Gallbladder surgery used to be a 2-week thing. In my lifetime, it used to be a 2-week thing, and now it's just nothing. It's just nothing. And we're so much smarter, we're so much richer, we're so much more, I mean, between science and technology and capitalism, I mean, you just think that we've never been on as good a path. And yet, every poll about this thing says that most Americans believe that we're heading the wrong direction. It doesn't really matter who the president is. Different people get fired up about it when a different guy's president, but and it just doesn't make sense. If we're as rich as we've ever been, and science is doing more than it ever has, and we have so much technology at our fingertips, I mean, I don't even have to run my vacuum any longer, right? The robot will vacuum my house. Do you know how awesome that would have been to 20-year-old Jeff? You don't have to do it anymore. I mean, there may be a day coming before too long where I won't even have to cook. I'll just tell the refrigerator what I want. I'll have a hamburger, and then it'll be there for me in just a few seconds. I mean, we're just amazing what all is getting done. Why are we all unhappy then? Could it be that all those things have nothing to do with what you're here for? That all of those things that are awesome, that none of them have anything to do with what you're made for. None of those things can address your sin. None of those things can help you see again. None of those things can do that. Only Jesus can do that. We keep putting our faith in everything else. And I do that too. I'm not judging. I mean, we keep putting our faith in everything else, and Jesus came to set you free. And what an awesome promise that is. So at the end of the service, we're going to give you a chance to pray. There's a phrase it was a phrase used when I was a kid. It's still used in some churches. Older churches will use it, but it's still a phrase that has never really lost a favor. You can lay all your burdens down at the foot of the cross. You can lay all those things down, and it's still true. And it doesn't mean, of course, if you come in here and you're on the brink of divorce, that just because you pray about it, everything will get better this afternoon. It does not mean, of course, that if you struggle with one addiction or another, just because you pray about it today, it'll suddenly be easier the rest of your life. Doesn't mean that. I've seen things like that happen, but they don't happen all the time. They don't. And there's no guarantee about any of that stuff. But it is a promise that if you come and say to Jesus, I can't carry this anymore, that he will help you. And that you can get that help today. So that's what we're going to pray about. So I'm going to pray with all of you, and I'll have the band come back up when we're praying. And then when we're done praying, if anybody needs to come up and pray, there'll be people on both sides and some people there in the back by the door who will pray with you. Let's pray.